476 AD, a 14-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus signs his own abdication with a trembling hand. He isn't executed. Instead, he's sent into exile with a pension for the rest of his life. This, perhaps, is the most humiliating aspect of it all in the story of the fall. The last emperor of Rome doesn't die like a god. He perishes as a mere nuisance to everyone. He's no longer worth the effort to kill. This is how the empire that had dominated the ancient world concludes. But here's what nobody quite explains. Rome didn't truly fall on that specific day in history. Rome had been in a state of slow, agonizing decline for centuries, a truth no one seemed willing to admit. To grasp this, we must rewind to the 3rd century, when the empire found itself gripped by a period of instability. Historians blandly term it the crisis of the 3rd century, as if a neutral name could diminish the underlying horror. Within a mere 50 years, Rome cycled through an astonishing 26 emperors in total for the empire. Most met their demise, assassinated by their very own soldiers in the dark of night. The army, once Rome's protector, had mutated into the most dangerous product the empire manufactured. Generals quickly learned that it was far simpler to seize a crown than to merely obey a weak leader. A loyal legion held more sway than any constitutional tradition that had ever existed for the empire. The most powerful man in Rome was no longer defined by legitimacy, but by the number of swords he commanded. The outcome was tragically predictable as the empire fractured into pieces after decades of absolute chaos. There were moments when 3 simultaneous Romes existed, each with its own emperor and its own army. The economy, understandably, collapsed under this chaos because no one dared to invest anymore. No one dared invest in an empire that might have a different ruler the following month today. Commerce froze, cities shrank, and people who once dwelled in sturdy stone houses began to make do with timber. Silently, materially, civilization itself began to recede, largely unnoticed by everyone. Diocletian, ascending to power in 284, attempted a radical solution to fix the empire. He formally divided the vast empire into 2 halves to render it governable at last. His vision included 4 simultaneous emperors, 2 senior and 2 junior, each responsible for a region. In practice, it was a delayed death sentence. For what Diocletian implicitly admitted was that a single man could no longer hold such an immense entity together. Rome, in its sprawling ambition, had simply grown too large to remain truly Rome. Relocated the capital to Constantinople, the beating heart of the Roman Empire was no longer in Rome, but situated in modern-day Turkey. Rome itself was reduced to a magnificent symbol utterly devoid of political power, a hollow, glorious name. Now, let's address the part that truly redefines everything you thought you knew about the fall. The primary issue wasn't the barbarians. For centuries, Rome had consistently contained and absorbed them. Rome had hired them and even Romanized them, but eventually grew dependent on these very groups. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, they weren't always pure invaders as many believe today. Many were foederati, contracted soldiers who fought under the Roman banner for land and payment. But when Rome began to neglect their pay, when it treated them as disposable tools for the empire, when it denied them the full citizenship they rightfully deserved for their years of loyal service, these allies decided to take what was owed to them by force using their own weapons. Alaric stands as the perfect illustration of this dynamic. He simply sought a permanent military title, but Rome repeatedly ignored and humiliated him. In 410, Alaric led his forces in the sack of Rome, the city that had not fallen to an enemy in 800 years. It was captured by a man who had dedicated his life to serving it. The sacking lasted 3 days. It wasn't the end of the empire, but it was undoubtedly the end of an idea. The Eternal City bled openly, and the entire world knew it. From Bethlehem, Jerome, the great translator, wrote of his inability to speak, of words failing him. Because the city that had conquered the world had now itself been conquered. Rome survived that brutal sacking, yet it could no longer deceive itself about its invulnerability. The economy proved to be the slowest, most insidious poison. For centuries, relentless conquest had financed the empire, bringing in slaves and precious metals. But when that expansion inevitably ceased, when there were no more provinces left to plunder, the entire model shattered. War continued to be costly, and armies still demanded payment. Emperors started printing more currency. Rampant inflation utterly decimated the middle class today. Small farmers lost their ancestral lands to landowners, becoming colony virtually serfs. The social mobility that had been a source of Rome's strength vanished. At this vulnerable point, a problem Rome had ignored suddenly exploded: the Huns. In 375 AD, Attila's predecessors were already pushing westward with a ferocity never adequately comprehended. The Huns harbored no desire to conquer Rome. They held no interest in taxes or the trappings of civilization. Their aim was destruction and movement. They unleashed a catastrophic domino effect on others, pushing the Visigoths, who pushed the Ostrogoths, who then pushed the Vandals into Roman borders. An irresistible pressure on the Roman borders that no wall, however mighty, could possibly contain. Thus, 476 AD isn't truly the end of Rome. It's merely the official death certificate. It is merely the official death certificate for something that had been mortally ill for decades. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed Romulus Augustulus. Crucially, he did not proclaim himself Emperor of the West. That detail matters immensely. He didn't aspire to be Roman. He simply wanted the territory for himself today. The imperial fiction had become utterly valueless, even to the one dismantling it. Meanwhile, the eastern half of the empire would survive for another 1,000 years as Byzantine. Greek-speaking, yet still referring to itself as Roman, it preserved the laws and art of heritage. It finally fell in 1453, when the Ottomans seized Constantinople, ending the Roman name. A full millennium of extra life, largely thanks to being on the correct side of the division. What truly died in 476 AD was not a civilization, but a power structure. It was a power structure that had become fatally addicted to its own colossal size. Rome expanded until it became ungovernable by any single person at that time. It hired armies until those very armies came to control it and the entire empire. It devalued its currency until money held no meaningful worth for any citizen. It systematically excluded those it desperately needed until the excluded exacted their revenge. The greatest empire the ancient world had ever known was not annihilated by external forces. It was meticulously hollowed out from within over a span of 300 years of decay. Until on the day it finally collapsed, there was simply nothing solid left to hold it up. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor, lived out his exile comfortably on his pension. Eventually dying of old age, the man who formally signed Rome's termination certificate slept soundly every night. The empire didn't conclude with a final epic battle, nor with a heroic figure valiantly dying to defend its walls from the enemies at the end. It ended with paperwork, a signature, and a child sent into retirement forever. The greatest empire in ancient history concluded without anyone possessing the grandeur to die for it. Oh,